Welcome back, everybody, to BRUBBLE, a podcast exploring young voices and perspectives from in and around the Brussels bubble. And you're watching us on, or listening to us, on a virtual medium in somewhat of a virtual world, some might say, in which is part of the larger metaverse. And for somebody like me who does not know much about these terms, I ask, what does this all mean? As you might, the listener, also be asking. So this week, we saw the European Commission publish their strategy on virtual worlds and Web 4.0. And so what does this mean? The question rings again. And so I'm joined here today by three of the prominent young voices in Metaverse from around the Brussels bubble to discuss a bit what the Metaverse is, what the virtual world really does, and why the Web 4.0 might actually matter. So getting into this, let us introduce ourselves quickly and dive right in. How are we all feeling today?
Very good.
Great.
Very good. Looking forward for the conversation, eh?
Yeah. Should we introduce before we even introduce ourselves, I think we have to touch on the elephant in the room, which you might call the white elephant in the room. The fact that we all, unfortunately, wore a white t-shirt or dress shirt.
The green trousers, by the way, just not
Yeah,
showing
you
up.
cannot see them. You cannot see them. I think
I promise we're wearing orange pants here, yellow here, green.
but also Alexandra has a little bit of a gold touch, which makes her different.
I tried
have
to
a
differentiate
little one.
myself from you guys.
Yes. Well, speaking about names, Alexandra, do you want to introduce yourself to the world? Tell them what you do in life and why the Metaverse is what you do.
Well, my name is Alexandra Schoiket. I work at FTI Consulting as a director, where I lead the Metaverse work that we do. I also am one of the co-coordinators of what we call our Future of Tech clusters, so really everything around emerging technologies, the Metaverse, Web 4, or Web 3, depending on your definitions, is really my bread and butter. I'm also a certified Metaverse expert by the Blockchain Council. So looking forward to getting to share some of that with you guys today.
I did not know you get certified as a Metaverse expert. It's like getting certified as a swimming instructor, right?
Exactly. Yeah, except, a little bit less underwater.
Fair enough. You help people not drown.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Who wants to go next? Patrick, you seem to be pretty keen, and I don't think you've drowned yet in your life, so please tell us, what do you do in life?
I don't want to follow that. No, so I lead the tech practice at Foretold here in Brussels, and I suppose I got into the Metaverse really because my background's in content moderation and increasingly emerging tech and AI, so it was just kind of the logical next step when you think about what are going to be the platforms and products of the future.
Yes, and you are also somewhat of an editor or content moderator of an interesting initiative called Metaverse.eu, where
Yes.
you can subscribe to for all the latest Metaverse and virtual world
So
information.
we're actually going to start with a shameless plug. That's amazing. Normally that comes right at the end.
And
Yes.
subscribe to the podcast as well.
I'd encourage everybody to read Metaverse EU. It's becoming a policy hub really now. We track and analyze what's going on here in the bubble and also the wider ecosystem in the EU.
Fair enough. And to the far end of the table, Gianluigi, tell us, who are you? Why are you at this table?
Okay, so it's super nice being at this table with my friends. I'm Gianluigi Vona. People call me Gigi, and I like it as a branded name. I work as a policy and communication advisor at Acumen Public Affairs, where I focus specifically on Web3 and Metaverse. Indeed, due to recent developments in the EU, Bubble, I already notified my typography to change the business cards to Web 4 advisor because unfortunately that's what it is. But I think we'll dive a little bit more into definitions and why I think the switch to Web 4 is not as great as some people think it is.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the first things we'll be diving into. What is the Metaverse versus what is the virtual worlds versus what is Web 4.0 and any other acronyms that might be floating around there. But before we do, I want to take a temperature of the room because I'm surrounded with a lot of people who have Metaverse or Web 4.0 in their official titles. I do not. To introduce myself quickly, I'm Simon. I work for Microsoft's European Government Affairs, where I do not work on Metaverse. I work in strategy and stakeholder management in a sense. So, being somewhat unfamiliar to this area, I'm quite skeptical about what the Metaverse really is. So going around the table, on a scale of 1 to 10, how influential, how big of a deal do you think the Metaverse really is? Patrick, you were laughing the most. Give us your...
I was laughing the most because of how hard a question it was.
Exactly.
I was thinking, please don't ask me. No, how important is it? as a concept. I think at the moment it's not really, you have many listeners that are wondering about this, and it's not really affecting people's lives, dramatically everywhere. And they'll be surprised even to hear that there's an initiative going on in the EU. That said, I think we can see the trends of where technology will go, and if not relevant now, particularly mainstream, I think in the future it will have a big impact on people's lives and businesses. And so we can talk about some of the case studies, but on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 to 10 now, or 1 to 10
right now.
Ever?
We'll check again at the end of the podcast.
Yeah, listen, I think
See if you've changed your mind.
I think we have to go above median here because we are seeing use cases emerge. So I'm going to sit on a safe 6.
Oh,
That's
really?
pretty low, I was gonna say.
Really, from you, coming
Gigi,
from you.
give us
The
your
editor and the co-founder of, and founder actually, founding partner of Metaverse EU. I was expecting a bit more from you.
It's prudent, I'm English.
On the safe side, on the safe side. A little bit higher, I'd say, because I think, and this is the first time I think we're going to make a lot of parallels with AI technology today, because there's a lot of things in common when it comes to the evolution and to how it can reach mass adoption. Totally agree with Patrick here. It's not impacting our lives, our day-to-day life yet. Yes, there are many good use cases when it comes to retails, a lot of good enterprise and industrial use cases already, so they don't impact us directly, but that's already like something that's really, really impactful when it comes to a business point of view. But at the same time, I think going forward, I think it is an 8 now, it's going to be a 10, 5 to 10 years from now. Of course, we need to get there. How do we get there? With a mix of policy and funding and a little bit of incentives here and there. But I think I'm pretty confident that we will get there. Maybe not now. So it's a bit like, I don't know if you've seen the sketch of David Letterman and was it Bill Gates when they talk about the internet. So what does the internet do? Why does it matter? And everyone was laughing because they said, okay, but this, we have the radio, this we have something else. So why does it matter? And everyone was laughing, and who's laughing now? So I think it's going to be a similar moment.
I see that the far end of the table has the typical Southern European optimism.
Yes,
So,
definitely.
should we go towards pessimism here, or are you also as optimistic, Alexandra?
I'm a Canadian, we're optimistic by nature, but no, I will. I'll take the ploy and I'll go to the other end of the spectrum, but mostly just because I also see a difference between where we are now, where we could potentially get, but also where we are now for consumers versus for industry. So if I can take that sort of extra delineation here, I'll say that, maybe the importance of the metaverse for consumers right now is probably quite low. I'd say we're probably at around, maybe a 3 or a 4. For industry, I'd say it's higher. I'd go towards Patrick, closer towards a 6. But where we could get to in the future, that's where I'd say I agree with Gigi. I think that's where we could really see the metaverse having a substantial impact across all, swaths of society, and where we could probably see it, moving up into that sort of 8, 9 range. But it really depends on exactly how it develops and how ultimately the technologies mature, and really how willing both consumers and industry is to sort of take up the mantle and use it to its full potential.
That was a much better answer. Can I do mine again?
It also wasn't a single answer, I will say. So
I was the girl in my high school yearbook who said, I have 2 questions. That was my yearbook quote, because I always would have, I put my hand up a couple times in a single class. So
in all seriousness, it's a valid distinction to make between industry and consumers. I think industry are already using much of these technologies that we're talking about, but obviously we're not seeing mass market for consumers just yet. But
yeah, and on what you were saying about you having 2 questions, I have 3 questions.
Oh, perfect.
What is the metaverse? What is a virtual world? And what is Web 4.0? And how do these definitions, collide into each other? What's the difference? What's the similarity?
Are you asking us, or are you asking what the EU thinks?
I think whatever is the best definition. If somebody asks you what the metaverse is, as somebody who's metaverse in your title, what do you say?
Oh, now we're just asking me. Okay,
Yeah.
I'm going to start with the first question because it's easier to answer. In terms of what's the distinction between those 3 terms, as far as what the EU is thinking, because they're the ones who basically introduced this whole new idea of Web 4.0.
Yeah.
And I think that the way that the Commission, at least, is conceptualizing this whole space is that you essentially have virtual worlds, which are these virtual communities in which people can live and work and socialize and entertain themselves, and where we can also have these great industrial developments. And then the collection of virtual worlds, whether they will be interoperable or not, is what the Commission is referring to as the Metaverse. And then my understanding is that what they're referring to as Web 4.0 is essentially then that sort of umbrella that will be on top of multiple metaverses. So you would have multiple networks of interoperable virtual worlds, which we will call the Metaverse, and multiple metaverses, which will basically comprise Web 4.0. This is different to the way that industry has referred to the Metaverse in the past. That's also because there hasn't been agreement on what the Metaverse actually is from industry. Some people will refer to the Metaverse as the Metaverse enabling technologies that we have today, and they'll call those the Metaverse. Some people will refer to the Metaverse as, a single virtual world or a collection of virtual worlds, and some people will refer to the capital M Metaverse, which I think is similar to the, Web 4.0 vision, the same way we have the capital I Internet, which is essentially this whole collection of virtual experiences. But I'd be curious to hear what Patrick and Gigi have to say.
I'm just going to really jump in because there's a couple of things we could pick up on that. When you said virtual worlds, I mean, for listeners, we're talking, you might imagine something like Sims or something, like a gaming world. Most of the virtual worlds we can imagine now are actually just gaming worlds. But the important difference is, and the relevance for the Metaverse, is that we're talking about worlds that are always existing, that are persistent. So you can leave, you can come back, your avatar, you experience them subjectively rather than just having characters like Sims, for example. So the examples here would be something like Second Life or even something like World of Warcraft. And then the question is, what's really unique about this? And that comes on to what Alexandra was saying with, they're all interconnected. And it's about this level of immersion too. But the issue I take with these definitions, these kind of definitions that focus on virtual worlds, is they didn't really predict or acknowledge augmented reality. And the way that we now have digital products that are sort of spilling into the physical world. And when we ask ourselves what is the Metaverse, we also have to ask what is actually the value of it. And for me, this is the value where it comes from the joining of the physical and the digital worlds. So if you're going to go shopping, you can try on clothes virtually rather than go to the store yourself. Or you have augmented reality sat navs or something like this. And this is if you can see the value being created between digital and virtual. I look at that and I go, that's actually emerging Metaverse.
No, and it's super interesting, and I think I'll chip in because I have a similar point that I want to make on augmented. Usually, we are a metaverse people, as you said. So I think we go through this question quite a lot, both in more formal settings, but also at family dinners, for example. So I have one definition that I really, really like. I really like to use it at Christmas dinners or whenever there is the uncle asking, so what are you doing? What is the metaverse? Why should I care? So I like to use a definition from a philosopher from this world, which is called 6529. I don't know if any one of you know him, but he's really, really good. Recommend reading some of his pieces. He says the easier way to define metaverse, saying the metaverse is the internet, with some differences. One big difference is the layer of visualizations. So the metaverse is internet with a way better layer of visualization, meaning that the internet, as we know, what is its layer of visualization? It's screens, it's pixelated screens, like an iPhone, like a monitor, like a bigger screen. But still, it's screens. It's two-dimensional screens. Whether the layer in the metaverse will be a blended augmentation of the physical and digital world. So it's like a hybrid physical-digital world where that is gonna basically replace a little bit our screen time. So now I don't see the metaverse as replacing our social life, our everyday life in such an impactful way from the beginning, but it's gonna slowly replace our screen time, our smartphone time, our monitor time. So that's a way that I think it is effective, rather than, because now most of the people, they imagine metaverse as a sort of a goofy, virtual reality, Second Life, where every one of us walk with VR and don't hang out with each other, don't talk with each other. So I think a better way to phrase it, especially for now, could be that. But that's my personal point of view, so I'm happy to hear what you think.
So somebody who's just a layperson here, I know I work in tech policy, but not in metaverse policy in that sense. It just seems to me that metaverse is just an evolution of the internet, where it becomes, I guess, more personal almost.
Someone also described it, speaking of definitions for your grandma, of the unflattening of the internet. It's the internet as we have now, but it's just more interactive than previous iteration.
Well, the key word is immersive, right? That's the word that keeps coming up again and again and again. And I think one of the central questions is whether or not, as we're sort of discussing here, whether or not you need to actually have a virtual reality in order to achieve a level of immersivity, or if you just need to have three-dimensional objects, or if you need to actually have sensations, because there's this whole conversation around sort of the development of haptic technologies as well, which, touch technologies that would allow you to actually, not just see things in a new way, but actually to have a physical experience of them in a new way in a virtual environment. And so I think that's really the key sort of point to explore is, what does it actually mean to achieve that sort of immersive. I think immersive and intuitive are the two words that came out quite a lot in the Commission's, at least the staff working document around the communication.
This reminds me a lot of back in the early 2000s when they had the 4D movies, where they had Descent as well, which I
they were
never...
splashing water like when they were going there.
Okay, look, I gotta say, I did one of those 4D movie experiences that was like a Minions one, and you were kind of jumping through the Minions sort of layer, and I gotta say, it was really fun.
Fair enough.
Futuristic.
Yeah. But then talking about what the metaverse is, what are the opportunities then that are coming from it? Because we've seen one big tech company who used to go by Facebook change its whole branding to be around the metaverse, and they obviously saw a big gap there, or a big opportunity for them to grab some market share. So why are companies, and not even just the big tech companies, but also businesses, why should they be concerned about the metaverse moving forward? Why will it rise to a 10? Why is it already a 6 or so in their importance?
I think one point I would like to quickly do before actually going into the opportunity, since you mentioned the company previously known as Facebook and now rebranded as Meta, I think that's also part of the reason why, for example, in official communication and an official initiative by the European Commission, like now there is a switch towards talking about virtual worlds and not metaverse, because they want to, let's say, to not associate themselves specifically to a company. And also that ties up also with the why Web 4 and not Web 3. I read a lot of interesting pieces on why the EU decided to go to the Web 4 definition, which is something that it wasn't as prominent before the Commission, right? Before the Commission initiative.
It didn't exist before.
Yes, we could say that. Some might disagree, but we could say that. So why they are going that direction as well is because they think that also now Web 3, so the whole Web 3, which starts as a decentralized internet, so something that's really not tied to specific companies and corporates, now they think that it's also being associated with specific companies, especially some of the big techs. So that's also part of the reason. And they want to stamp their mark like with big word, and to make sure that we are not, let's say, that EU is not associated with specific American companies. So that's a point I wanted to make. I don't know what you think, because the web, I think we're going to discuss more in deep also about the terminology. But
I just want to add something to that, because I think that is one reading on why they changed the terminology. But just to go back, we haven't actually talked about what Web 4 might mean. And what was kind of interesting when reading the initiative is if you just took out the words Web 4 and put Metaverse in, I think a lot of people in the Metaverse field would actually agree that's what it is. So what was interesting, later the day after the publication of this communication that came out this week, was we saw Thierry Breton, who's responsible for the initiative, actually tweets, really great to have this Web 4, aka the Metaverse initiative. After all of this time, the word does not appear in the document, in the main text, and then we have this confirmation that it is the Metaverse after all. So needless confusion, I think, but I think some of the reasons Gigi mentioned might be behind that.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I actually, since I already sort of talked a little bit about the terminology, I'd prefer to go back to the original question, which was, ultimately, why should businesses care about this? And I think that there are really, a number of reasons why business. I should probably preface this by saying that right now I'm speaking in my own sort of personal capacity. I'm not speaking on behalf of any specific client of FTI. But I do think that there are a number of reasons why businesses should care. First of all, because the market is growing. Despite the fact that there have been, layoffs around some metaverse initiatives, and all of this sort of rhetoric on like the metaverse is dead, and certainly in the hype cycle, ChatGPT definitely took over from a lot of the kind of focus on the metaverse. The investments are still happening. There's a huge amount of VC funding that's still going into metaverse projects, and the technology is going to continue to develop, which means we're going to keep having more and more useful experiences, and I think probably you'll see that in industry first before it actually really has an impact on consumers. And that's really why businesses should start paying attention. We'll start to see more kind of professional metaverse experiences, these kinds of more interactive and immersive conferencing sort of options. You'll also see more practical training and teaching experiences. There's already quite a lot of work going on with augmented reality training in various different companies, on manufacturing floors, but also training for, sensitivity training or training around, how to deal with in-store shootings, that kind of thing, and doing all of those kinds of trainings. And that's going to become, I think, even more sophisticated in the future. And then you also have, huge potentials for digital twinning and, how that can make ultimately, again, sort of especially manufacturing plants more efficient, more sustainable, and ultimately more productive. So I think that as the technologies become, as they mature, as they become, and the applications become a little bit more sophisticated and wide-ranging, there will be a lot of advantages for companies to be sort of the first movers in the space, and a big risk of being left behind if they aren't properly investing in those technologies and integrating them into their current working environments.
Do we think it's the leading digital technology that companies need to be investing in, or is this more of a nice to have, or one that will develop over the next 5 years, as you were hinting to?
Yeah, I think if you look at the digital landscape on the horizon for the future, what else are we really looking at here? We just have this massive package of digital regulations that cover so many different sectors that I think this will spill over into the next mandate. And what we saw with the AI Act is this is just a communication, but it kind of with AI we had like three communications in 2 years. 2 years later, this white paper with the proposal, and then 2 years later, an AI Act. So we might see a similar path for metaverse policy. So back to the question of why should companies care, is because this we may see emergent policy here, and there's obviously going to be business risks that could merge with that too. I think in the next mandate, we might see a few more initiatives, and I don't think we're going to expect like a Metaverse Act or anything like this, but we might see some sector-specific initiatives that would be worth keeping track of for many different businesses.
Maybe a white paper, like a virtual worlds white paper, could be something that could be on the table sooner rather than later, I think. But responding to the question as well, I think it's not nice to have. There are huge business opportunities, hence why, as you said, like some companies rebranded themselves to reflect the company, to reflect the concept. Some others are investing millions and millions and millions into these technologies. The market is expected to grow to a staggering, I think, 800 billion is the number mentioned in the communication. But of course, like it is numbers, it's predictions and forecasts. But no, it's one of the big things. Of course, now probably like headlines and media attention has switched, as also Alexandra was saying, like towards AI, and that's also a little bit in the financial and VC world. But at the same time, in parallel, like there is a lot going on behind the scenes on Metaverse and Web3, Web4, as we want to call it, technologies. It's just, I think, it's a little bit like it was for AI like 4 or 5 years ago. There was not this media frenzy about it because most of the applications and the use cases were also industrial, healthcare, so not really consumer faced. When we're gonna have one big use case for consumers, that's what's gonna make it like boom and what's gonna make it reach like sort of a mass adoption. Are we there? Not. Are we going to be there in 2 years? Probably not. But within the 5 to 10 years, I expect one big use case that's gonna make the market boom, and then everyone is gonna say, fuck. But so sorry.
Beat that out.
So the metaverse actually is important. It's not that.
No, but it's interesting that you mentioned it that way, comparing it to AI 5 years ago, because what we're seeing nowadays too is that different companies have different strategies for how visible they make AI in their processes. Because a lot of companies, perhaps like Apple, they have a lot of AI work going on. They just don't call it AI work. And is this something similar we'll see with Metaverse, for instance, where we'll see companies necessarily move into Metaverse to make, their services more efficient, to, be faster, but they just won't call it Metaverse?
Yeah, I think Roblox recently moved away from calling it that. One of the spokespeople said specifically, this is not a Metaverse strategy, talking about one of their announcements.
Mm-hmm.
And then this week they announced that the Roblox is going to be compatible with Quest Pro, which I think for most people in the industry would say, well, that's the most Metaverse-y product we can imagine right now. So. I think just as the people were jumping on the PR in the good days, I think you'll see them moving away from it if they think it's a smart move business-wise.
You mentioned Apple. I mean, it's what Apple has done. Like, they're not calling it virtual world, they're not calling it metaverse, they're calling it spatial computing, which is also another term, adds to the media confusion, but at the same time, finally, it's still building on this augmentation of our reality into.
But to be clear, I mean, Apple don't even call the phone a smartphone, so that's just their brand, I think.
I mean, but if also we're throwing in other terms, we haven't even talked about extended reality, right? Like, it's not just that it's AR and VR and MR, but like we have the whole umbrella term of extended reality or XR, and that's also sort of interchangeable with concepts around the metaverse to a large extent. And I think that's also where you see a lot of investments. Again, when people talk about what the metaverse market might be valued, what they're actually talking about is what the XR market will be valued at in 2030, because the metaverse market, depending on what kind of, like, again, capital M metaverse or Web 4.0 metaverse, depending on what you're actually imagining, that's not going to be here by 2030. And the reality is that this,
Can I quickly just go over what XR is, just in case people don't know?
Sure, go ahead.
No, I was offering you.
Now you go.
Well, no, please. Okay. Extended reality, known as XR, is basically an umbrella term for virtual reality, augmented reality, and mixed reality. Now, the difference, hopefully the audience know what virtual reality is. Augmented reality is where you project a digital layer on the physical world. Mixed reality is there's actually disagreements about what this means. Some people think it's like you have a bit like spatial computing, really. You can put like an object in the middle of the room and be able to walk around it in a way that you can't do with AR. Some people say it's just the same. Other people say, look, why don't we just call everything extended reality? Because now we have headsets where the standard is everything has extended reality as well as virtual reality. So maybe just get rid of all of the terms under the umbrella. Everything's XR from hereafter. But anyway. Well,
and you'll notice that, again, the terms are sometimes used a little bit interchangeably, especially in the staff working document, So I think that's, another source of confusion. But the point that I wanted to make was that this strategy that the Commission has come up with is essentially geared towards, structured around the principles of the digital decade, which expires in 2030. So I personally, at least, don't believe that we will get to this Web 4.0 by 2030. Maybe we'll get to Web 3 by then. Maybe we'll actualize more elements of Web 3 because it's still, in many respects, unrealized. But I don't see how we would really sort of take that extra step towards Web 4. And so I do think that what we are going to see, and maybe this again is one of the reasons why companies should be paying attention, is that moving forward, I think the next commission, whose term will be expiring just before the end of the digital decade, are going to have to rethink some of those goals and ambitions and principles, and are going to have to come up with at least new strategies or roadmaps or initiatives that'll help sort of guide the market towards the potential of realizing this hypothetical within the next digital decade, so to speak. And I think that will be something that'll be really interesting to keep an eye on moving forward.
I hope they will be even more ambitious than they were with this communication, because now, I don't know if we are gonna talk in detail about the communication, but
what next on the agenda.
Okay, perfect. So I'll be super brief, but you'll get my reaction on that later. But I think that overall it's very good that they acknowledge the importance and the socio-economical benefits. But at the same time, I will dive more deep into why I think they should have been more concrete and more ambitious in some of the aspects, especially because of what Alexandra is saying. Because we need to get there. In order to get there, we need proper funding and a little bit of more clarity on certain regulatory aspects, which are not there yet.
I don't want this to be my job just to keep doing this, but I'm just cautious that your audience might not know all these terminologies we're throwing around. So also the digital decade, do people know what that is?
It's pretty self-explanatory, no?
Okay, well maybe I need to treat your audience better.
This is about the BRUBBLE, you know. So
But sometimes you don't realize when you're in these policy areas, you step out and everyone's like, well, what is that again?
No, but you're good at giving definitions, Patrick. So
No,
at the
please.
very least, I
Yeah.
can make a little like TikTok clips channel of you just defining everything.
Okay.
But go ahead, digital decade.
This isn't going on TikTok, my god.
It's not, but
In short, it's a set of, I forget how many, I think like 10 targets that they wanted, that the Commission aimed for member states to achieve by 2030. It's kind of confusing they call it digital decade because they say like the next 10 years, but we're now in 2023. Anyway, so like this is, for example, things like gigabyte internet of everybody is the main one, and that's super relevant for the metaverse. I think we also want to see them be a bit more specific in terms of latency and bandwidth because just having coverage doesn't necessarily mean people are using it. But yeah, so that's what they are.
yeah. Should we move, while we're on the topic of the Commission and how well we've alluded, I think, every few minutes towards this strategy that was recently published, should we go over a bit about what the European Commission did a few days ago when they published their strategy on the virtual worlds / bracket line Web 4.0? They had both of them in the title, which was confusing. But do we want to give a quick explanation of what this strategy is, what it said, and what it means?
Yes, I think Alexandra has made a fantastic LinkedIn post. By the way, you should check that out.
Thank you, Gigi.
So I think you should go for you should start and then we chip in.
Oh, sure. Well, I thought you were actually volunteering to go first, but I love that I've been voluntold to lead the discussion there. Happy to do so.
Such a Canadian term.
So what the Commission is ultimately trying to do with this strategy is, so first of all, maybe worth saying that a communication, in the interest of defining the terms, a communication is a non-legislative document, so it doesn't have any sort of formal legal implications. Essentially, what it is a roadmap or a set of commitments that the European Commission has proposed that are essentially aimed to guide its work around Web 4.0 and virtual worlds. And there are, I think, 10 actions in the communication that are all, set to be achieved between sort of now and I think Q2 of next year. So just in time for the elections and just in time for the next legislature to create a new strategy or an updated strategy. And these actions are around essentially these sort of three pillars. There's a lot of actions around digital skills. So the idea of increasing the uptake of digital skills technology and increasing the number of ICT specialists in the EU and, crossing the digital divide and ensuring equal access for, empowering consumers and protecting children and all of that. There's also a piece around businesses. So this is about giving businesses the resources that they need in order to be able to develop in virtual spaces and, sort of working with industry on the development of, to understand what they actually need from government in this area in order to be successful, especially SMEs and startups. And the third piece is around governance, and that's really where they talk about, working with sort of international bodies and also national bodies, coordinating better with member states and working to, sort of better monitor the development of virtual worlds, and also seek to, maybe develop new standards and that will help to, ensure that as they develop, they are developed according to European values and principles. How was that? Was that a pretty good summary?
Fantastic.
Anything else you guys want to add? Did I forget something?
Do you want to maybe add Patrick and Gigi as well? Because you guys have been a bit more very hyping it up, this communication coming out. Did it meet your expectations? Was this what you expected the Commission to publish?
Expected, yes. Hoped for, maybe I was hoping for a little bit more. Like, it's an excellent starting point. I think it's a building block. It set the scene. It reflects on not only the ambitious, not only the acknowledgement of metaverse from the EU, but also the ambition to lead, to become a global leader on that. So that's fantastic, and that's something that probably, if they told me like 1 year ago, in 1 year, the EU is gonna want to become a pioneer on metaverse, I would say, really? So that's something that's really, really, that's really good. But at the same time, some of the aspects are not reflecting enough this type of ambitions, because you want to be a global leader, but you cannot just be a global leader by saying so. You need to actually act, and you need to have a certain type of actions and certain type of framework to become a global leader. And I think on that point it's slightly lack a little bit more clarity, especially on, okay, where do we stand now? What do we need? Like, for example, like on policy framework, like the EU, we all know the EU. Do we need to define the EU, Patrick? Or okay, it's called the BRUBBLE, I think. No, because I saw you thinking. I saw you thinking. Okay, so the EU has a very well developed legislative framework when it comes to digital and to platforms and to rules. So we have a very solid base, but at the same time, there are certain aspects which cannot be included already in that framework, because immersive settings are not the same as text-based settings, as the current internet and content type of actions that we do. So there are some gaps that needs to be addressed, and they are not very clearly mentioned there. But also, I think to become a global champion, like, you also need to empower a lot EU companies, SMEs and startups. And there I think there is a little bit less clarity on how do we want to empower them, especially when it comes to financing. Because yes, some official sources mentioned that like 800 million are going to be used from like EU funding to push for this transition and transformation, modern transition. But at the same time, it's not clear. Like, it's not a number that's made in the communication. And this is something that, for example, I would expect maybe a dedicated fund, like, I don't know, like a virtual worlds fund within the umbrella of existing instruments. I think this would have been something really nice. I would have loved and appreciated that, especially because it's true that there are a lot of champions when it comes to SMEs and startups, especially in the XR ecosystem, that needs to be incentivized. And I think they could benefit from more clarity when it comes to financing. I don't know, what do you want to add?
So
what's missing?
Definition of the EU now.
Yes.
There you go. Definition, Patrick. Go.
No, obviously, I agree with, I think, most of what Gigi said. In defense of the Commission, and let's be clear, this is a very fluffy document. I think, Alexandra, if you read Alex's summary, you'll think this is one of the greatest achievements of the last 10 years. But really, it's not like that. It's full of vague language and promises that are even vaguer. Things like apparently a toolbox is a solution to everything from cybersecurity to privacy to safety to children to women's empowerment. It's not quite clear, but it wasn't really meant to be clear. The goal of the communication is not to set out a crystal clear path towards future initiatives. It's really to do what we're doing now and to start a discussion, which I think it will definitely create. And one thing that I did notice in terms of a change in tone, because I've been following this topic since they announced it last year. In the last 9 months, you've been getting a lot of noises that the EU might try and create a European metaverse, and that was obviously not welcome news to a lot of the world, and also people that believe in the technology itself. Because at the end of the day, it's likely, I think, that many EU consumers will be using products from non-EU companies. So it's important to, I think, engage with international players. And this communication, I think, was quite clear. I think the EU does intend to join, and hopefully it will actually start leading these international multi-stakeholder initiatives. Things like the World Economic Forum, they do great work in this space, and I'd love to see the EU getting more involved.
Yeah.
And if I may also go for this one, just apart from giving the full background of the communication, I would also, I have to agree with a lot of what Patrick and Gigi have both said. I also think that in general, what the communication, maybe one of the limitations of the communication is that, again, possibly because it is structured around these digital decade goals, which were formulated a few years ago, there is naturally a kind of little bit more of a backward look to a communication that is really supposed to be forward-facing. And you see that sort of iterated in a few different ways. You see it iterated in the sense that a lot of the tools that the Commission proposes and coordination bodies that the Commission is mentioning are ones that already exist, as we've already discussed. They also, I think rightly, are not proposing a new legislative framework, but they are referring to a lot of different pieces of legislation that should help to address some of the, potential regulatory gaps that the metaverse might bring about. And, it's a bit up for debate whether or not they actually will be sufficient to be able to do so. So you've got a little bit more of a backward look there. And then also, I think there's a little bit of a kind of backwards look in the sense that they're really not properly acknowledging, in some respects, the true potential of Web3, and also what kind of new possibilities and also risks that that space might open up. And I'm thinking principally here about the sort of creator economy, which I think is really not given a huge amount of space in the communication. And this was something I was reflecting on recently, where they're talking quite a lot about empowering users to be able to, use these technologies, and empowering SMEs and startups to be able to build these technologies, and working with companies, to ensure that whatever metaverse is developed is according to EU values and is, going to protect consumer data and have all of these, great attributes. There's very little about, where individual content creators can step in and how they might be able to monetize their assets in a decentralized space, and what kind of new opportunities for decentralized governance we have, and all of that. Besides the fact that the connectivity bit is completely absent, because that's going to be handled in a different piece of legislation, and as Patrick alluded to earlier, that's also going to be a big question of whether or not how we would actually attain the kind of latency bandwidth requirements.
I don't know if you heard those sirens, but it's the definition police here.
Web3?
So Web3 and decentralization too. I think these are totally alien concepts to most people. I don't know if I can tackle these ones as well.
Do you want to? I can try, but
this is go for it.
They're complicated terms. Well, they are defined in the commission staff working document, and then there's tons of definitions for them, around as well. But okay, I'm going to do decentralization first, because it's part of, I think, what we're trying to achieve with this dream of Web3. So currently, the Web 2 internet is essentially built around centralized ecosystems, which means essentially at the center of every website you have a company, or there is a company, a startup, a person, someone who can be held sort of, or some entity that can be held responsible for the protection of consumers, for, that can be ultimately held liable for any harm that could befall users, et cetera, et cetera. In a decentralized ecosystem is one that could hypothetically be built on blockchain technologies, which are these distributed ledger technologies. Please don't ask me to try to define it more than that, Patrick. Which, in very, very simple terms, and I apologize to any of the tech geeks who might be listening to this, but in very simple terms, will allow for the decentralized storage and transfer of information that is essentially can be tracked, and therefore should theoretically be enable more trust in sort of data exchange across various ecosystems that are not managed by a sort of single recognizable, identifiable entity, and that leads to a lot of really exciting possibilities, as I mentioned, in terms of how you can, instead of just being hired by a specific company to develop digital assets for a specific company, a developer can essentially take control over their own assets, and individual consumers can theoretically take control over their own data, and they can find new ways to sort of monetize that across these different ecosystems. Without that sort of central reliance. But it also leads to new problems, in the sense that now you no longer have a central entity responsible for consumer protection, and that can be held liable if something goes wrong, and whatever. So I think that we are going to see more problems coming out as we move towards that sort of decentralized Web3 space that we're going to have to acknowledge, and that's, I think, maybe moving forward, where we sort of see the next sort of most immediate set of risks and opportunities. But we probably don't have space to go into that in this podcast. If you want to know more, you can come talk to me at FTI.
Exactly.
There you go. Second plug.
Just quickly before your question, I think it's important to note in this space as well, we often have the narrative of centralization or decentralization, but a lot of the products we already see are sort of hybrid systems of both, and I think that's kind of the more likely future, rather than going down one path.
That just made it so much more unclear.
Look, but if you think about it this way, you might have like a decentralized metaverse, which would be a collection of decentralized virtual worlds that are all interoperable and communicate with each other. And you can also have, at the same time, existing centralized metaverse, which would be a collection of, centralized operators who choose to agree on the same kind of, standards and protocols, and they have their own collection of virtual worlds. And theoretically, you could have both existing at the same time.
I think we've just broken Simon's brain.
It makes sense, but I'll have to gestate on it a bit, which I encourage the listeners to do so as well. But
can I give you just one example on the because I find it useful for myself. I have to constantly remind myself what decentralization means. So if you think about money, so the value of money is managed through the banks who print it, right? And so there's a central resource that manages the value of it. Something like diamonds is that there's no central resource managing the exchange. The value is determined by
the need, right?
The need, yes. So that said, you can then have a system where there is a diamond exchanger who comes in, and although the value is generally determined by the market, there still can be a central resource that manages it. So I hope that helps a little.
Yeah, and if you're super confused, I also did a blockchain episode about half a year ago.
With Tommaso, no?
I believe so, yes. So shout out to Tommaso.
Another plug. This is perfect.
But before we start wrapping up completely, because I've lingered quite a bit on the document, I do want to wrap up a bit by saying, reflecting on the EU strategy that released and reflecting on the whole trajectory of Web 4.0, virtual worlds, metaverse. It's still not clear to me what I should be calling it. But what do you think the future is? When we come back, if we ever come back in a year's time, what will have changed? Will there be new opportunities? Will there be new legislative things that we should be keeping our eye on? And I'm just going to give you each a few minutes just to, I suppose, spitball out your ideas.
I think both. We're definitely, if we make a revamp of this episode, I think in 3-4 years' time, I think there's going to be a lot to talk about when it comes to regulation, when it comes to policy initiatives, when it comes to frameworks, not only EU-wide, but also potentially international-wide and globally-wide and global-wide. At the same time, we're going to talk about way new use cases that maybe were created in the time, and they made it way more consumer friendly, more useful for consumers in their day-to-day lives. At the same time, I expect, as we were discussing before, we all mentioned these industrial and enterprise use cases, these are going to boom. I expect digital twins of everything. There's going to be a digital twin of this studio, probably, in some virtual world, and we're going to have similar type of podcasts there as well. Everything is going to be twinned. Learning experience are going to be enhanced by these technologies by a lot. Cultural and tourism as well is going to be, I think, impacted a lot. You're going to see a lot of augmented reality type of experience. I imagine going to Pompeii, for example, which is something I'm from Napoli, so now shameless plug for my city, Napoli, amazing city. Go there, don't trust, sometimes the media skepticism about it. If you need to go there, you know who to contact. I have plenty of tips. But some people go to Pompeii. Pompeii is amazing. Pompeii is breathtaking because you go there and you already can see a lot of what happened, unfortunately, years and years ago. But some of these parts, I would imagine, not with the VR goggle, because that would be a little bit too much. But in 5 to 6 to 10 years' time, we're going to have a hardware that's going to be way lighter, way less impactful, potentially closer to a sunglass than to what VRs are now. At least that's my hope. It's not easy technologically wise, but that's my hope. And you're just gonna click, and then you're gonna see a lot of what actually was there before, when it comes to paintings, when it comes to recreation, on how things were done. So I think a lot of potential in the tourism and the cultural industry as well. And then retail, sports and entertainment. When it comes to concerts, I'm sure in 5 years' time, all 4 of us are going to be at least 1 or 2 virtual concerts. One of our favorite, rappers or artists.
At least we'll get those Taylor Swift tickets, right?
There you go. Yes, no need to queue and refresh for 20 hours.
Patrick.
Well, look, if we do come back here in 1 year's time, we are going to coordinate our outfits because this is absurd.
Yes.
In a metaverse, we could change it, right? Using this augmented reality.
Be pink.
No, look, I completely agree with the industrial use cases, and I think that's if you're a company looking to manufacture a car, I think companies are quickly working out that it's cheaper to simulate that and improve processes digitally than it is to actually build the entire factory. So I think that's kind of an obvious use case I think we'll see more of. In terms of the consumer side, the dream is always to have a sort of mainstream headset that people are going to use. But what does that actually look like? Like, how small does it have to be for people to put it on their heads for a long amount of time? I think in the sort of nearish future, we might see people replacing things like desktops, maybe even like a laptop or something like this, and moving instead towards one of these headsets, if it is able to produce the same experience. People in single-person households might not buy TVs. This is the kind of progress that I sort of foresee in the next 5 years. I'm going to be braver because everybody says 10 years and I think it's a cop-out.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I'm a bit more skeptical on how willing people are to move towards something you stick on your head. I think it'd be more like your phones will get more powerful and use that as a tool to interact with the world around you. And that's where I see that would develop. Maybe some specialized apparatus for like some really niche industrial uses and stuff, but I'm
It's
just
also an
skeptical.
intermediate step.
Yeah.
It's an intermediate step. And then when technology is going to be lighter and slimmer and thinner, and then people are not going to have these, let's say, they don't have to worry about having a heavy thing on their head for a long amount of time.
I think you'll expect more of the physical environment to be digital. As you say, walking around with a phone through a shop, or when you go to order a meal, maybe you see the whole meal now instead of the menu on the QR code.
I mean, you see that more and often now. They don't even give menus in some places, just a QR code to scan to your
Imagine having the meal, so you can see actually how it looks like. Because sometimes I
You
do
can
it.
taste it
Sometimes maybe you can taste it. Sometimes I do it. I go on the Google Maps and I try to look at what actually the dishes from the menu look like based on photos. But I mean, I would like it from time to time to know.
Yeah.
But Alexandra, you've been trying to chip in for for a few minutes ago.
I know, and I'm gonna forget half of the things I wanted to say now. But no, I think because really the question is also whether or not we're actually going to need to develop again the VR and AR headsets in order to access this metaverse, right? And I think this is sort of related to what you were saying. Yeah, I think we're going to have more and more applications that are also accessible on our phones. Pokemon Go was a few years ago, right, already, and that was this sort of great blending of the physical and the virtual worlds, right? Even a few years ago, I think I was in the airport, in the Brussels airport, and there was like a hologram display for the great Flemish painters, and it was this little cherub that kind of crawled out of a painting and then was flitting around the wall and like looking at other paintings, right? I didn't need anything for that. I didn't need to access it through my phone or glasses or anything. There was just this sort of cool hologram that was jumping around on the wall. Maybe in the future that will actually be something that we can interact with, or maybe you can interact with it on your phone. And I mean, again, that already exists for children in art galleries where they can have these sort of put their phone up to a painting and the painting comes to life. So, I think that we'll see, more and more of those kind of technologies, which will be really cool, and also might, delay somewhat the conversation around, what kind of biometrics are companies actually, data are they actually acquiring from you when you use virtual reality headsets, and that's a whole different conversation for another day, but another really interesting sort of policy field. And the last thing I'll say is, a year from now, putting on again my sort of public affairs hat. Or headset, as the case may be. Do you have one? Can I walk out of here with a
lens upstairs?
Perfect, excellent. Can't wait to take that in my goodie bag. I think the other part of it is a year from now there are going to be new laws that are going to be adopted in the EU that are going to be part of this body of legislation that is expected to regulate the metaverse, and also will be a little bit further into the adoption of other laws that have sort of recently entered into force that are also intended to create a more kind of equitable and competitive business environment, ideally globally. So I'm not going to name drop them now because I don't want Patrick to force me to have to define all of them. But let's just say that it's a substantial body of legislation, and it'll be really interesting a year from now to see sort of if that has had any sort of notable change on the actual business environment here in the EU.
Cool.
So 1 year from now, we're going to try the new Apple VR, which is something that I'm looking forward to try because apparently it's quite...
Can't say that in the Microsoft office, come on.
I know.
We'll edit that out.
Personal point of view, I'm looking forward to try it, and I was quite happy with the...
Is it a date then? Are we all coming back in a year, or...?
We should do it and then do it with like headsets instead.
I'd love that. We could start the whole thing. It'll be a new kind of twinning. We'll just all wear our headsets across the board.
Just don't acknowledge that we're wearing headsets and continue as normal.
Yes, exactly.
Or it could be, because I know YouTube you can do the 3D videos, right? they should they should do one where you can choose which perspective to watch on the person talking.
That'd be pretty cool.
Ooh.
I think that would be super cool.
That would be just like 3D
But no,
TVs. I
now
think.
I'm just
Fun
setting
for, like,
expectations.
Or we
so
can-
high.
we
Yes,
can-
exactly.
Why don't we go one step further? Why don't we just go for the whole deepfake thing, and I can actually be represented here as anybody I want. Which historical figure would you choose?
That's a good way to end up the episode.
Oh.
I always end it on a more personal question. Which historical
Answer.
which historical figure would you like to be deepfaked as?
Is this you turning the question now back around on
Yes,
me
he's
instead of
trying to-
answering
no,
it?
no, you answer
It's better
first.
than the original question I had. So
I mean, I think it would be pretty cool. Well, I don't know if I should pick a powerful. I think it would be very cool to either be represented as Leonardo da Vinci, because he's one of my favorite historical figures, or can I just pick, like, some badass chick like Amelia Earhart, or Marie Curie? I'd like to. I think
both met tragic ends though. So,
yeah. Well, hopefully that won't say anything about about what the future has in store.
I mean, for myself, the one thing I would have, I'm quite a tall person, so I'd have to have a tall historical figure.
Not necessarily. You could
could
see
go-
the world from a whole different perspective.
From a lower perspective. but-
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's
Go
a
as Bilbo.
question. Historical, right?
Yeah.
Of course, that preceded us. I don't know. Yeah, I'll give it a thought. Not entirely sure. Patrick, I'm gonna throw it to you.
God, I was hoping you were going to go to GG.
No.
So the question is, who would we want to come back as for the next podcast?
Yeah.
Yeah, deepfaked as.
Or actually, okay, I see. I'm going to pick. I'm going to go with Vincent van Gogh.
I mean, you'd barely be deepfaked.
Yeah.
I don't think
I'll take that as
we'll
a,
take
That's
up
really
the
just
air.
an
Yes,
AR filter.
exactly. We just need to count.
that's what, I was going to make it easy for you guys, make it most realistic.
I don't know if I can say that because we're in a Microsoft office.
Go for it.
But then maybe it's Steve Jobs.
Oh,
okay.
this guy.
With the turtleneck, I would love that. And talk about the future of, because I would have loved to hear his thoughts
In all
on
fairness,
the metaverse and
people
what's
would
the
probably
direction.
think you were be a much more authoritative figure, actually, compared to Leonardo da Vinci. So
Or Van Gogh.
on the metaverse.
I'd go with some really flamboyant philosopher like Jean-Jacques Rousseau or something, just
Oh.
to
Okay, but-
flip the table by end,
Yes.
That's good.
Yeah, that's some perspective.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
Deal. Let's see.
Deal
let's
if
see.
I could work on the technical aspects. You're really overestimating
Well,
my.
yeah, that's
Okay,
why
for all
my
developers
paper's so
out
good.
there, all developers, if you're listening to this podcast, help
Yes.
us make this a reality.
Deepfake us. Okay. Well, I think this is a good way to wrap it all together. I think it's been a very intriguing conversation on not only metaverse, but also virtual worlds, on Web 4.0, on the EV, the
XR?
XR, yes.
No, not yet. But,
I'm confusing terms, but if you want more information on the subject, all of my co-panelists here have interesting things they're putting out on a pretty frequent basis. If you have anything you want to plug towards the end, feel free to go for it.
I mean, definitely check out Metaverse EU, which is becoming one of the main policy hubs for news related to Metaverse. Of course, you can always reach out to me personally on LinkedIn. I'm quite active there. You'll find Gianluigi Vona brackets GG to help with the GG and to avoid mistakes on spelling of my name, which
Apologies.
is something I don't like. And also, you can always reach out to the team at Acumen Public Affairs, which consists of some other policy professionals that are going to help with regulatory aspects of these emerging technologies.
Yeah, I'll drop your links in the description below. But
Yeah, that'd be really helpful, because I'm really come talk to me on LinkedIn or any of my incredible colleagues at FTI Consulting. We are a global advisory firm, and we have different experts working on not just sort of the public policy side of things, but also experts who are working actively with companies now, advising them on the implementation of these technologies, and also on the sort of legal compliance aspects of these technologies. So we really have quite a sort of diverse group of experts, so really do feel free to come and chat with us, and happy to answer any questions that anyone might have.
Patrick?
Yeah, pretty much the same. I plugged it at the beginning. I would just say I'm also ramping up my Twitter postings, so please come and join along. Patrick Green.
Late to the train, but
I
What about Threads?
Not Threads.
Threads.
you can't access it in the EU. So.
Well, there's ways. And then, yes, of course, I think Forthold is the leading consultancy in Brussels on this topic, so I'd encourage everyone to reach out.
Mic drop.
And if you want to listen to more of these podcast episodes, there should be a new one releasing next week on golden passports, which is also cool. And we'll see if that ever becomes a Metaverse issue. But yeah. Well,
Very nice.
For that then, I think we'll end it here. And thank you, the listener, for listening. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, share. You can watch it, I should have said this at the beginning, but you can watch it on YouTube as well as listen to it. So if you only listen to it and want to see our faces, head over. But yeah, cool.
Thanks very much.
Hosting. Thanks for hosting us. It was great fun, and as we said before, looked a bit like a conversation among friends. So that's something
I was looking at the
really
time.
enjoyed.
I feel like we could have gone for ages.
Yeah.
I think there's so much that we could still talk about. We'll come back and we'll do it in a year.
Yes, we'll do that.